Hello, and I'm here today with Peter Graham of Santa Fe Relocation. So welcome,
Hi Fiona,
Peter.
thank you.
And we're going to talk about your fantastic report and survey, Repurpose, which won the Relocate Award, of course, just this year. So tell us a bit about the background to the topic and the survey for 2021.
So the report that we issued last year, we actually started work on in November of 2019, when we started to discuss amongst a small group the questions we wanted to ask in the research, because we get the research done by an independent research company, and we need to put all the questions together first to give to them. So we spent November, pre-COVID, pre-anybody ever really hearing anything about COVID, we started that discussion then.
And may I ask how large the survey was?
We had 858 people, I think, responded to it initially. But what we did, because of the COVID situation, which sort of came really into being, I suppose, during the time we were out doing the research. So some of those people who answered the research in the early stage would probably have not been affected at that point in time by COVID. Towards the end, it obviously would be a very different picture. So it was important for us then to probably check with people. So we had a series of round tables that we did during the sort of early part of the summer last year to try to sense check what we'd been learning and what we were inferring from the research that we'd done, and to make sure that it remained valid. And we spoke to lots of different customers on these roundtable calls to get that information. And then for the next few months, mostly the author-in-chief, John Rason, was busy writing the report with those of us who were involved helping to contribute to bits of it. And it was published unusually late last year, but because of the pandemic we published it, I think, in September. And we then followed that up with a series of, this time around, video calls where we did video briefings for people, and we'd have a panel presenting and asking questions so that people could interact, with the people who'd been involved in the report, which took us through till November last year, when we started to plan this year's.
Yes, quite.
And last Friday we finished the research part of that work. So we're in this. With the cycle it's an annual thing, and it never stops really.
And so, what were the major trends that came out of the repurpose?
I suppose a lot of what we were picking up, particularly, was COVID-related things that had changed. Certainly, the reaction of assignees to COVID and what it meant for them. And I think what we saw, with obviously some exceptions, was that the vast majority of people who were away on long-term assignments were quite happy to stay put where they were. They didn't want to come back to their home country. People on short-term assignments, however, obviously were very keen to get back home. They knew they were only going to be away for a short time, so they wanted to, I think, to get somewhere safe or safer to them, maybe, being home, and stay put there until the thing had passed or conditions had got better. So that became the first thing, and there was a lot of, and we saw with global mobility professionals all over the world that their main concern was making sure that people were all right, that they were in a place they wanted to be, and getting that done. And that probably lasted until the early part of the summer, and then we started to see people reacting to what had happened, and looking at policies for things like remote working, which became a really, really hot topic at the time last year, and the most senior HR directors talking to us and people like us about developing policies, because a lot of them didn't have policies. They were being asked about somebody remote working, which was no longer, I want to work at home anymore, but I quite like to go, and I've got a cottage in Morocco on a mountaintop, can I go and work there, please? It's also my second home, so why can't I work there? And that became something that was really quite taxing for senior people as they started to try to react to that. Some industries, I think, were quite quick to adapt. I think the tech industry was quick to adapt, partly because I believe that they were probably well along that journey already anyway. But things like remote working became an important selling point for them when they were trying to attract the right talent into their organisation. And it was a competitive differentiator for them between other people who might be fishing in the same pool of talent. But there was also a whole range of duty of care issues that I suppose hadn't surfaced before, maybe, or not. They were never spoken about as much, certainly. And people concerned of people at home working on their own, for instance, young people, single people in a flat on their own. How cut off are they going to be? How's their mental health going to be managed? So I certainly saw a huge number of initiatives taken by organisations to try and address that. And I know in Santa Fe, one of the things we did is we sort of started to keep our cameras on when we were doing calls, where historically we hadn't really done that. When we knew each other, we'd just do a sort of like a Skype call, but now we were doing team calls, Zoom calls with videos on, so we could see each other, and it just enhanced the personal feel of the call. It's just quite an important step, I think, just in terms of addressing that. And I know the senior managers who ran regular, and they still run monthly town halls for all the staff to talk to them and to tell them how we're doing. Always spend time talking about people's health and the things that they need to take and address and take care of. And so it's been a good environment in that sense, and it's been interesting to see senior managers, not just in our organisation, but in a lot of places, taking probably more interest in that sort of dynamic. I think we're now starting to get people starting to try to plan for the future. I've seen that in the last few months. People maybe see the light at the end of the tunnel in some places at least, and they're starting to look at what their future plans might be. My own sense of it is, we've had things that have happened in the world in the past, and 9/11 is a good example, when air travel stopped, for instance, foreign travel stopped for a period of time, but ultimately it caught up again and continued to grow. And I suspect we'll probably see something similar in terms of particularly global mobility, because I think the importance of people learning new skills in different cultures continues to be important for any global company. For people to be able to do that. Maybe the business travel side will suffer a little bit. I think we'll see far fewer people travelling around the world for internal meetings, for instance, but still people on the sales side, for instance, still need to go out and meet new people and develop contacts, and you can really only do that properly, I think, in a sort of real-time, face-to-face environment. So that will catch up. But the compliance side of things is going to, I think, become ever more important now, and we're seeing that already. Much more importance given to pre-travel checks about what are the implications of going, do I need permission? And a lot of companies introducing, approvals processes to require people to get travel authority, even if it's for a short-term trip.
So risk compliance, those are number one. Your particular expertise is immigration. So do you feel people know what they're doing, or did they at the time, and what are they doing to translate that into policies?
I think on the assignment side, for people doing global mobility assignments, I think most people were reasonably well informed. There's a general assumption, even if you don't have the direct knowledge, that you need a visa for that. And the more risky area from a compliance perspective was the business travel side, because people were going, often booking their own flights and just claiming it back on expenses, and going somewhere and not being aware of whether what they were doing required a work permit visa or not. Even for a number of days, sometimes you can do if you're doing work in particular categories. So that's become something that people haven't really addressed very well in the past. And you've then sort of layered on top of that the whole COVID piece. So if you think about all of the issues that are now around travelling from a COVID point of view, have you had a test before you travel? Do you need to have a test on arrival? Do you need to have a vaccination certificate on arrival? And if so, what form does that take to be able to satisfy somebody that you've been vaccinated? We don't have a common sort of system globally yet to do that. I think it'll come, and I know that ICAO and IATA are working on that, but it's not there yet. Are there going to be quarantine requirements? So for a long-term assignee going somewhere, having to quarantine for a couple of weeks, maybe not seem like an unreasonable thing, but for a business traveller going for 2 days of meetings, to have to quarantine for 14 days is going to seem a little bit unnecessary. And again, that's the riskier area anyway, I think, from a compliance point of view. From a duty of care point of view, it was something I used to ask this time last year to ask people. So have you got any idea of your business travellers, how many of them have been in China in the last 6 months, for instance? And of those, how many of them have been in the Hubei area, which is where Wuhan is? And they just didn't know. And that's when they start to feel vulnerable, when they realise there's a real life example to look at, rather than just a theoretical type of question. So we've certainly seen much more interest in that. Global mobility, interestingly, have become much more involved in business travel than they have ever been, in my experience. And I think that's because of the compliance risks that are now identified, and also because of the duty of care issue. Business travel has often been in the past a very transactional, financially based, it's all about saving money and just doing things as cost effectively as possible and just get it done type of approach. Whereas now, I think that duty of care element and the safety of their people travelling has become much more important.
And the cost of international science and expensive talent is also adding up.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yes. So tell me a bit more about issues regarding the employee themselves. Are they more reluctant, do you think, to take up an international assignment or accept one? Or are there people still or getting their appetite back to travel and take up an assignment?
The feedback I've had from our clients, who would be the sort of HR global mobility teams, is that they are not having a huge amount of problems finding people who are very keen to go overseas. I think people are maybe being a little bit more selective about the destinations, and that in itself might cause problems for some. So a reluctance to go to China, for instance, is being seen as where the outbreak started. People a bit more reluctant there. But equally what we're seeing, I think, and I have done a lot of work during my career on the global supply chain, and I think what we've seen is a realization that this reliance on a just-in-time supply chain model, global supply chain model, really doesn't give you the resilience you need when something like this type of pandemic happens, and people are starting to diversify their supply chains and not put all their eggs in the one basket, for instance. So production facilities in one country only is being seen now as not a very wise move, and it's better to diversify. So we have been tracking growth in the Southeast Asia region, particularly in countries like Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, who've made a lot of effort in their area to try to attract more inward investment and to diversify their own infrastructure to support more companies coming in to use their production facilities. Not to replace what was already there, but to if you like, give it a bit more resilience, and so that they don't have to put all their eggs in the one basket going forward. So that's been quite an interesting thing to watch and track, and to see government ministers, prime ministers, presidents coming out and publicly saying these types of things is unusual, shall we say.
And what about assignment lengths? Are they getting shorter, do you think?
I'm not sure they are. I think again it's down to the individuals, because I think when people who uproot their lives for a trip to maybe the other side of the world, they probably want to spend a reasonable chunk of time there and doing it, and so I mean, actually my sister is the wife of an assignee for one of the big banks who's working in Africa and living in Africa, and they've just extended their 3-year stay by another 2 years. So there's that side of it as well. They've looking at a different aspect of life, and if you come from a developed Western country, there is something to be gained by going somewhere maybe that's sort of economically not as well developed, and being able to contribute more to improving that. And I think what we have seen, and whether you're an assignee or whether you're home based or home working or a business traveller, is quality of life has become a much more important issue, I think, than it ever was, really. And for employers to make sure that their employees are having a decent quality of life seems to become a much more important thing. And if there's one good thing that's come out of the pandemic, I'd say that's probably it.
So what do you think you're going to be concentrating on in the new report?
I mean, the report itself is quite interesting. We're sort of producing our 10th one this year.
Quite an achievement.
And we're planning to do a sort of little summary, which will come out first, I think, which is the last 10 years, because quite often, when you're looking at strategic change, it takes place over a much longer period than 12 months. So to look back and see where we were 10 years ago and measure the distance, the difference between now and then, is going to be really quite interesting. So that work's going on at the moment, actually. And I'm really looking forward to see what that tells us. I think this year's report will be probably, I'm not going to put a name on it, but it's going to be probably a little bit similar to last year, but with a much stronger COVID influence now because people have been through a full year of that and they've got a better grasp of the implications of that and what it might mean. And I'm thinking that some of the things I've said to you in the last few minutes will either be fulfilled in that report or I'll be made to look a little bit silly, but which is always the problem and the risk when you're looking into the future,
Yeah. So finally, in conclusion, what do you think are the main takeaways for global mobility, either immediately or projecting far into the future?
I think in a lot of places I've seen global mobility colleagues have put themselves right at the top table over the last 12 months. They've become maybe a more important part of the organisation than they have been in the past. And I think their role has started to shift and to change. They're becoming much more responsible for mobility generally. So I talked about assignments and more about short-term assignments and business travel as well, because compliance is important, but duty of care is important. So I think they've become much more involved. And I've spoken to clients in very big global organisations, and they're now on all of their companies' sort of emergency boards and planning boards because it's such a critical bit of their business that they have involved. So they have, through their efforts, and they've done some amazing work, and we've heard some amazing stories. They have put themselves there, and I hope that continues because they deserve to be there to speak for those people who are, maybe a little bit disconnected from the centre of an organisation. And it's easy when you're overseas to be forgotten, I think. So I used to manage overseas people myself when I was in the immigration department. I was HR director there for a number of years, and it was easy to forget people, and I knew that one of their complaints was that they were forgotten, and when it came to promotions they were often overlooked, and because if they weren't in your face every day, then they got forgotten about. So I think some of that is changing, though. I think some of that is changing. We've seen that technology has obviously improved a lot as well to help make it easier to communicate via technology. So there's no really excuses now not to be able to communicate. But I think what we will see as well is that face-to-face meetings will continue to be important, critically important for a lot of people.
And then finally, stab in the dark,
Yeah.
what do you think are going to be the hot spots in the next year or two in terms of geographical locations?
Well, I mean, I've had a view for probably 2 years now that to some extent we're seeing a reversal in recent years of the traditional west to east trend. And I think we have started to see through organisations like Huawei and some of the Chinese companies a bigger east to west movement now, as those companies start to grow in the rest of the world. South America, when they get over the pandemic, which has hit them pretty hard, is certainly something that we've seen a massive increase in interest in that part of the world. We've sort of started to prepare a little bit more in developing relationships in Africa as well, although I think that's probably going to follow on behind South America. So I think you'll see there will be a shift, an east to west shift, and we've started to see that already, I think, and that will only continue to grow. And as other countries become more developed, they're going to want to grow globally as well. So it's to make it quite an interesting place.
And what tips do you have for companies and organisations to help support the business case and shift government perspectives on immigration? Is that worth doing, and would you urge?
So I published a white paper last week, actually, on compliance, immigration compliance around business travel. And that was partly to help people in global mobility make the business case to invest in solutions in that area, because they're sort of mostly trying to manage, and we've discovered this through our report, mostly trying to manage large business travel populations using an Excel spreadsheet, which is really not sophisticated enough anymore to deal with the risks and issues, and also to adopt a more pre-travel type of approach. I think historically travel compliance was very much about the tax compliance, and it was tended to be done 6 months after the person had come back from the trip, and you looked and see whether it had raised any tax liabilities. Whereas now, because of COVID partly, but because of immigration rules, you don't get into the country anymore if you can't meet the COVID regulations, if you don't have the right visa, if you need a visa, and you need to check all of these things before you travel to avoid risk and to avoid not just the financial penalties and hardship to people who might, in some cases even have to spend a night in a cell somewhere in an airport before they get sent back home. They're not being allowed in, and it can happen to famous people too. We saw one case in South America a couple of years ago where Phil Collins, the famous musician, was held up and locked up at the airport because he didn't have the right visa to give a concert. I think that culminated later on that day in him being released, because I think the authorities didn't fancy the idea of 100,000 Brazilians being upset that their concert wasn't going to go ahead. But, those sort of things happen, and they don't just happen to ordinary people as well. They happen to well-known people too who've got a high profile. So greater risks, I think. So, and COVID will mean people, I think governments certainly in the next few years are going to be much more careful about who they let into their countries.
Well, that was a fascinating insight, Peter. Thank you very much for talking to us, and many congratulations on the report, and good luck with the 10th anniversary edition. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fiona. Really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.